To those of you who may want to ask, let me address very directly, I did not kill my daughter, JonBenet. JonBenet and I had a very close relationship. I will miss her dearly for the rest of my life.
I'm Patsy Ramsey, JonBenet's mother, and I'm grateful that we are finally able to meet together face to face. I'm appalled that anyone would think that John or I would be involved in such a hideous, heinous crime. But let me assure you that I did not kill JonBenet. I did not have anything to do with it. I love that child with my whole of my heart and soul.
Here, her mother Patsy being interrogated by police more than a year later.
You know, quit screwing around asking me about things that are ridiculous and let's find the person that did this.
You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record. Okay, how is everybody? Wanted to talk today about the Netflix documentary, 3-part documentary written and directed by Joe Berlinger, who was part of the team, one half of the team that brought us the Paradise Lost documentaries on the West Memphis 3. So you can see where this is going. I really did have a little hope for it. I thought, well, this isn't a controversial case. I mean, sure, we had the ABC documentary, or what do you call that? ABC, yeah, it was an ABC documentary where they did the Burke did it theory, which dare not say its name anymore because they were sued terribly. That was horrible. And I thought, well, that sort of passed like a fart in the wind. I mean, hasn't everybody just come to the conclusion, the same conclusion? I mean, we had John Mark Carr, this fake guy come up, this attention-seeking guy, basically arrested and questioned for JonBenet's killing, and that turned out to be a big hoax. I mean, hasn't anybody figured it out yet? But apparently not. Apparently, this is going to be a case, according to this documentary, solved with DNA. To me, it was another fake true crime documentary trying to downplay the most obvious things and the biggest pieces of evidence in the case and upplay small theories, small ideas, improbable things, everything that happens in innocence fraud. And so I thought it would be a really good subject to talk about, just to come into. And I'm going to start with, so I basically picked 5 things I wanted to talk about. I don't know if I'm going to be able to talk about them all tonight in depth in the way I want to, so I may be returning to this. But the first thing I wanted to talk about is obviously the fact that there is a real effort in this documentary to poo-poo the idea, downplay the idea that John and Patsy Ramsey are real suspects, the point of the documentary, and we have to remember it has John Ramsey's participation. So already that's a bad thing. This is something that I've seen in the Netflix documentary, The Vow, about NXIVM. Once you have someone like Nancy Salzman, who's like number 2 in NXIVM, and a lot of the high-ups in NXIVM telling the story, you're not going to get a true story of what happened, because they have to make deals. The same thing with the Hulu documentary about Larry Ray, the lost kids of Sarah Lawrence. We had Isabella Pollock's participation in that. So already we know it's not going to be an honest documentary. To have anything that John Ramsey wants to participate in is going to be something to push away the idea, any of the focus from him and Patsy, and keep it on the idea that DNA is going to solve this. And if I were John Ramsey, I would be saying the same thing. I hope I would never do or be involved in such a terrible thing, in my opinion, or be in that position, let's put it that way. But it certainly benefits him to put out this notion that this is going to be a DNA case. We'll come back to that. But first off, let's look at the ransom note, the actual ransom note, before we get into it, because this is also downplayed. And they say that this ransom note is like a little unusual, just a little unusual. Not that it's the longest ransom note in the history of the world, the most unusual, certainly, ransom note, the phoniest ransom note that's ever been written in the history of the world. There's so many things wrong with it. I think we'll just get into it and start looking at it bit by bit. Hold on one second. Let me pull it up. So first off, it starts off with Mr. Ramsey. And the fact that there was a practice ransom note, this was written on Patsy's notepad, and we'll talk about the handwriting in a bit. But Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. So first of all, you don't say listen carefully. You say that many people have speculated that this was written because it was dictated to Patsy Ramsey, who wrote it, possibly with her left hand. She was ambidextrous. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. So this looks like in the beginning also that they're really trying to disguise it. The handwriting gets a little better as it goes along. We respect your business. Oh, that's so nice, but not the country that it serves. So who benefits from wanting to point this at foreigners? At this time, we have your daughter in our possession, spelled correctly. I can't remember. Is that spelled wrongly? I can't remember. But they do spell attaché correctly. She is safe and unharmed. And if you want her, I think it's wrong. If you want to see her in 1997, you must follow our instructions to the letter. You will withdraw $118,000, which was exactly the money amount of John Ramsey's bonus from the year before. From your account, $100,000 will be in $100 bills, and the remaining $18,000 in $20 bills. Make sure that you bring an adequate size attaché to the bank. They're so helpful. Like, if it wasn't in the right attaché, we can't bring the money. We don't have a proper attaché. This sounds like someone who really cares about John, doesn't it? When you get home, you will put the money in a brown paper bag. I will call you between 8 and 10 tomorrow to instruct you on delivery. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. Again, they care. They're very caring, these foreign faction. They care about him being rested. Like, they never really go through this whole thing in the documentary. It's so absurd. If we monitor you getting the money early, we might call you early to arrange an earlier delivery of the money and hence an earlier pickup of your daughter. You see how it's gotten less wavy, the handwriting? Any deviations of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. You will also be, so they're a little harsh, but they still care about his rest, and they admire his business, but not the country it serves. You will also be denied her remains for proper burial. The two gentlemen watching, so there's the first hint that she might no longer be living. The two gentlemen watching over your daughter are don't particularly like you. It's not that they hate him, they just don't like him very much. So I advise you not to provoke them. This is a very PG ransom note for sure. So I advise you not to provoke them, speaking to anyone about your situation, such as the police, FBI, etc., will result in your daughter being beheaded. So I guess that they're trying to do some kind of Middle Eastern thing. If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. If you alert bank authorities, she dies. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, she dies. You will be scanned for electronic devices. And if any are found, she dies. You can try to deceive us, but be warned that we are familiar with law enforcement countermeasures and tactics. You stand a 99% chance of killing your daughter if you try to outsmart us. Follow our instructions, and you stand 100% chance of getting her back. You and your family are under constant scrutiny, as well as the authorities. Don't try to grow a brain, John. Another quote from a movie. You are not the only fat cat around, so don't think that killing will be difficult. I mean, if they were foreign, they would know fat cat. Odd. Don't underestimate us, John. Use that good Southern common sense of yours. Another compliment. It is up to you now, John. Victory, SBTC. So who would benefit from staging a fake kidnapping? Someone in the home, right? Something that's gone terribly wrong in the home, and you want to point outward. And this is about the phoniest ransom note that's ever been written in the history of the world. If there's a more ridiculous one, I haven't heard it. Serial Weck points out some issues with this note. He was a lawyer and also a medical examiner, coroner, and he wrote a book called Who Killed JonBenet. Here's his take. Here's some of his take on what's wrong with the whole idea of a intruder and the ransom note. Take a listen.
I'm sure that they've got to have pen and paper in the middle of the night in total darkness, not worrying about waking anybody up. He's already broken into the house without waking anybody up. He knew exactly where the little girl's bedroom was. He knew, most importantly and incredibly, where this room was down in the basement that the cops didn't even go into. they searched the whole house at 6 o'clock in the morning and never even saw this room, never even entered into it. It wasn't until 7 hours later that John Ramsey, with his then good friend Fleet White, did a second search. And John Ramsey, upon opening up that door, exclaimed, and according to Fleet White later on, even before the lights had been turned on, "Oh my God!" And there lay JonBenet. But this intruder knew all that. So in any event, now the chutzpah continues. This incredible bravado.
That's one benefit of this documentary. You really get to see how the house is really like a maze. How the intruder could maneuver. And I don't believe he could get through that window with unscathed. I don't think a full-sized man could fit through that window, but I don't think anyone's saying a small woman did this. I think there's so many problems. And repeatedly they say in the documentary, there's no sign of break-in, and then they just go on. But there's this window, but the window was left open. And I know that they tried to prove that you could go through it, but it's pretty hard. And then maneuver your way in the dark in that house. It's like a maze.
Flows through his veins, and he's going to take his time. He finds the pen and paper, and he sits down to write the ransom note. He doesn't like his beginning, and he crumples the first piece of paper. He knows that one day your program and thousands of other programs and books and articles that will be written about this case, he wants to make sure that what he writes is going to be literarily acceptable. So he starts again. And we represent a foreign faction, and blah, 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 and so on. He misspells a couple of words, possess and another word, but interestingly, he knows how to spell attaché, even with that little apostrophe, or whatever the French call it, above the E.
The accent, which also JonBenet has on her name.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's right. That he knows, okay? And he writes this ransom note, and Donna said 100,000 plus. It was exactly $118,000. One of the things, Tricia, that I love to do when I speak about this case to audiences is I look out and with a smile on.
This is an interview that Cyril Weck did with Web Sleuths. If you want to hear Tricia Griffiths from Web Sleuths, if you want to hear the whole thing, the link is listed in the description of this episode.
My face, I look at the audience and I'll say, "You, sir," I say, "You know, I don't know, you don't look like you've done much kidnapping. How much would you charge? How much would you want to take in on a kidnapping for the daughter of a multimillionaire? What would you say, 25,000? The guy would usually shake his head. Then I'll go to someone else in the audience. I'll say, "Now, I don't know, you look like you might have been around a little bit longer," and I'll work it up. But then I'll say, "Is anybody here? You know what the sum was that was asked for in the JonBenet Ramsey case? $118,000. That's a nice round figure, right? I mean, happens to be the exact amount that John Ramsey received as a bonus from his company the year before. Now, you tell me, besides John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey and his accountant and his tax lawyer, you tell me what other people knew about a $118,000 bonus." But
right. And in the documentary, they say that the bonus was close. It was 118,600, I believe they say in the documentary, something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's what I heard. They left off the $600. It's $18,000. It's such an odd number for such a high risk.
that's what this kidnapper asked for. And then, having had that incredible courage and lack of any concern about people finding him, hearing him, or so on, he leaves the house after having done all of these things. And what did he forget? Well, Dawn has already given the answer. I'm sorry she did, because that's my other favorite. That's my other favorite tack with the audience. And it's amazing. It's amazing. You'll talk with intelligent audiences, doctors, lawyers, school teachers, newsmen. And what did he forget? And there's stunned silence. Once in a while, somebody will think about it. Most often, they don't think. When I say, what did he forget? And I say, how about the body? How about the body? You
Right. How about the body? So you forget the body. Because the motive for this is supposed to be money. This is a really important point in this case. That money was neither asked for, a note was left. So, if you think about the Lindbergh kidnapping, where the baby was deceased, the Lindbergh baby, they kept on. They got the money. And they didn't, right? They withheld the fact that the baby was dead because it was a real kidnapping. I know some people disagree with me about that case. But you would take the body, and why leave the note? So what is the motivation? What is the motivation for that note? And that's the biggest piece of evidence left. The crime scene is corrupted. I think they put it, of course, they heavily blame the police for that and not the Ramseys, who John Ramsey was told not to touch anything. Another really important point. We'll look at Linda Arndt's interview in a second, but she's sort of poo-pooed as one of these people. Basically, anybody who ever even suspected the Ramseys did it, someone in the Ramseys' home. And I rule out Burke. And I have read the book Foreign Faction, and I just wasn't convinced by it. I know the arguments for the Burke did it people. I understand. I'm just not on board with that. I think that anybody who they point in this to anybody who did this is like someone crazy. Like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with Linda Arndt? What's wrong with the police who worked this case? Were so wrong-headed. Same innocence fraud narrative we hear in every single documentary. Tunnel vision investigation. Well, it was tunnel vision for a reason. This note was bizarre. Everything that was done to JonBenet was done with, or any kind of evidence was something from the home. So you think a kidnapper is going to just write a 3-page note like that? That's crazy. That's crazy. But the rational, it's like everything, once again, is upside down. The rational people are crazy, and the irrational people are right on the money. And it's bizarre that people don't listen to them. And they sort of make this argument through the entire documentary that the Ramseys are a target to be arrested and tried with this, but when it comes to the grand jury and the grand jury indicts them, they don't go forward. They drop the charges. So, I mean, how out to get the Ramseys were they? It is not natural for here's another thing, a really important point, is it's not normal for parents of a missing child to not cooperate with an investigation. Usually they will take lie detector tests. They just want their child back. They want to find who did something to their child, even a child who's deceased. This is not normal to give all these interviews, TV interviews, but not talk to the police. So that rightfully triggered the police to thinking that the Ramseys did it. Here, let's look at Linda Arndt's. She was the first police officer on the scene. Just
talked with Linda Arndt, the Colorado detective who first handled the case, and she had her own suspicions about who the killer was.
JonBenet.
Oh, hello.
Nearly 3 years after the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, the case remains unsolved.
My feeling is that Patsy was an unwitting accomplice. I think she didn't know what to do, and she didn't want to give up her husband, and participated with the writing of the note. But I think that John did most of it. That's where I'm at right now with this case. But it had to be one of the two of them. I don't think that Burke at his age was capable of this, as troubled as he's been made out in some reports.
But the detective who first handled the case has no questions about who is guilty.
I know who killed JonBenet. There's no doubt in my mind who killed JonBenet. And while this investigation is still ongoing, I don't think it's appropriate that I say that name out loud.
Linda Arndt was the first detective on the scene at the Ramsey house on December 26, 1996, the morning John and Patsy Ramsey had reported their 6-year-old daughter JonBenet missing. Arndt was the only officer there for much of the day. She later would be roundly criticized, vilified in the press as responsible for a bungled investigation. Now she's speaking out to set the record straight, telling her side of that dramatic day 3 years ago. It all began with a call at 6:30 in the morning from her sergeant.
He said there's been a kidnapping. It involves a 6-year-old girl. There was a ransom note, a 2.5-page ransom note. And according to the ransom note, there was going to be a phone call from the author, and they were supposed to call between 8 and 10 a.m. So I was supposed to get to the house for purposes of monitoring the phone call.
8:10 a.m., Arndt arrived at the Ramsey home and meets John Ramsey for the first time.
How did he strike you?
Cordial.
Cordial?
Mm-hmm.
Upset?
Cordial.
Distraught?
Cordial.
Did it?
Right. So they should be expecting the call from the kidnappers any minute yet. There should be no time for niceties. Because the kidnapper said they would even call early. And yeah, she does look like she has possibly Graves' disease or some kind of issue that puts pressure on your eyes and makes them bug out a little bit. But she was there on the time it had for the action. So I think what she has to say is interesting.
Strike you at all that that was behavior that was unusual for somebody whose child was just kidnapped?
It's been my experience that people respond to trauma in different ways. So if someone has a response that is different from mine, I don't put judgment to it. I'll just note it.
And that is what she says she did all morning, make mental notes of all things curious, including, she says, the fact that Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey remained apart in separate rooms for most of the day. That at one point, she says John Ramsey took time out in the middle of the crisis to read his mail.
I remember seeing John in the kitchen, looking through his mail, and I made a note that he was looking at his mail, and then I wondered, where did your mail come from?
Isn't it possible maybe he was opening the mail looking for a clue from the kidnapper?
I don't know.
Right. And that's something that he argues in this documentary. I was looking for a clue from the kidnapper. So he's getting ideas from the interviewer here. He was casually, if he was looking for clues from the kidnapper, he's casually looking for clues. Not like, hey, everybody, let's look through my mail. Maybe there's another. Wouldn't you give half of it to one person and half of it to another person? Or, hey, don't talk to me. Maybe let me scan this really quick. You wouldn't casually be opening up mail, slowly looking through it. That's a very different demeanor than than what I would think you would be doing when you were scanning your mail for kidnappers' correspondence.
And I don't speculate. It's a piece of information that I see. It's something that I know.
You thought it was unusual, however.
I can say that it stuck out.
10 a.m., the deadline imposed by the writer of the ransom note for a telephone call.
10 o'clock comes and goes, and there's no acknowledgement within the house from anyone that the deadline imposed by the author of the ransom note has come and gone.
No.
That is a major, major red flag. Major red flag. You would be waiting on bated breath. Remember, the kidnapper said that they would perhaps even call early. They might be early. So Arndt arrives at 8:10, which could already be considered late if you're taking this note seriously. Why didn't they take the note seriously? Because they knew already the note wasn't serious. That's the only logical answer. You would be waiting on bated breath for any communication. And if he was looking through his mail for clues, why does at 10 a.m. come and go without him saying a peep? Odd, right? Very odd. So I disagree with this documentary that the parents were looked at unfairly. I think they were looked at very fairly. Maybe too fairly. When the grand jury indicts them and everyone agrees to not go ahead with it, why have a grand jury in that case? Grand juries all heard from all sides, and they indicted the parents. That should tell you something.
Nobody said it's 10 o'clock and the kidnappers haven't called?
Nobody said that.
Was that something else you took note of?
Absolutely.
By 10:30 in the morning, Arndt was the only police officer in the house with John and Patsy Ramsey, their pastor, and 4 family friends. As they waited for news, the tension was mounting. Arndt called her station house for backup repeatedly, but none had arrived.
How many times did you call the police department asking where your backup was and what was going on?
Well, I remember at least 2 calls. Both times I was told everybody's in a meeting. They got your message. And that was it.
Were you feeling pressure being in charge of a group this large and with anxiety that high?
I felt tremendous pressure.
1:01 p.m. Although the house had already been searched by patrolmen before she arrived, Arndt says that in order to break the building tension, she asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to search the house again, top to bottom, looking for anything out of place. She says she gave...
This is a really important point. She asked them to search the house top to bottom, and they searched the house bottom to top. And John Ramsey says in the documentary, well, of course I went to the basement. That's the most logical place to start, at the bottom. But she said top to bottom. He started right where she was, and he found her in the dark before the lights turned on and said, there she is. Little like Karen Reed, he psychically could see her before anyone else. Wonder why?
Gave them specific instructions not to touch anything. She says John Ramsey headed straight to the basement. She heard Fleet White scream for an ambulance, and then a chilling discovery. For Arndt, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place.
And I see John Ramsey carrying JonBenet up the last 3 steps from the basement. And my mind exploded. And everything that I had noted that morning that stuck out instantly made sense. And JonBenet was clearly dead. Then she's been dead for a while. I ordered him to put JonBenet down. I knelt next to her and I leaned down to her face. And John leaned down opposite me. And his face was just inches from mine. And we had a nonverbal exchange that I will never forget. And he asked if she was dead. And I said, yes, she's dead. And I told him to go back to the room and to dial 911. And as we looked at each other, I remember, and I wore a shoulder holster, tucking my gun right next to me and consciously counting, I've got 18 bullets.
So that's a real phenomenon, women's fear sensation. Maybe it's just because I've been trained by Gavin DeBecker's company. I consider it really important when women have like a fear reflex like that. She felt that this man is dangerous and could hurt her. And that's what she's saying. I grabbed my bullet. I grabbed my gun for safety. I think it's important. It's an important detail in the story that, again, this documentary overlooks. They show a little of this, but not the whole thing. And when they get to this part, they just are like, wow, the woman's had it off her rocker. She was so scared she reached for her gun. That's a serious, because women are smaller and weaker physically than men, we tend to develop a sixth sense. I think it's just, you can see animals have it too, like a fear response to things. And she's got a fear response to John Ramsey. Whatever that eye communication, her response was to be afraid. And I think that's not to be blown off as female hysteria.
Why did you do that?
Because I didn't know if we'd all be alive when people showed up. I said everything made sense in that instance. And I knew what happened.
Do you think your fear was well-founded?
She's saying this guy was willing to stage a kidnapping to cover up his crime. He may be willing to get rid of me to evade his crime.
You bet I do. There's no doubt in my mind.
To this day?
Never wavered.
You were afraid because you thought the killer was still in the house.
I knew it.
Absolutely?
Absolutely.
1:10 p.m., Detective Arndt moved JonBenet's body from the hallway to the living room.
John Ramsey came back into the living room, and he grabbed a throw that was on the back of a chair, and he says, could you please cover her body? And as he's saying it, he's already put the blanket on top of her.
Arndt would later be harshly criticized for two key decisions: asking John Ramsey to search the house and allowing John Ramsey.
Well, she asked him to search the house and she said, don't touch anything. But he decided, which is another key point in this that's left out of the documentary, to corrupt the crime scene, which strangely benefited him and his wife and whoever else was in the home. Do you see how everything was done to push away from the home?
To place the blanket on JonBenet's body.
You had to know that that was going to contaminate evidence.
JonBenet's body was in and of itself a crime scene. Would it be nice if John hadn't found JonBenet? Absolutely. And would it be nice if he hadn't put a blanket? Yeah, it would be great. And it would be nice if there were other people to help control and keep people away. That would have been wonderful. But that's not the circumstances that I had available that day.
Still alone in the living room with John Ramsey, Arndt then heard Patsy Ramsey's voice.
And I heard a wail, just a guttural moan, aching wail from the back area. It's probably one of the most pitiful things I've ever heard, and anguished. And I saw the rest of the people, the Patsy and the pastor and the four friends, come from the den towards the living room. So I said, if you want to say goodbye to JonBenet, this is the only time you'll have to do it. And, oh, there's just so much. There's so much pain. And I called that.
This is a kind of pain you see in Linda Arndt that you don't see in John Ramsey when he gives interviews. And you do see grief, and Patsy Ramsey was terribly medicated through most of her interviews. And she was struggling fighting cancer, and that's used in the documentary as a way to deflect off the Ramseys. To say the Ramseys, the whole family was struggling with Patsy's health. How dare the police? Because of course the police are put in the crosshairs and criticized. How dare the police? But had they I think you could make a fairer argument that after they were indicted by the grand jury, that they should have had a trial. And at least we could have seen all the evidence, the public. But being what I consider another in the innocence fraud documentary in some ways, it just follows the recipe totally, is in that they just say, like, it doesn't even make any sense what they're arguing. They're arguing that the Ramseys were so hated and they wanted to get them so badly at every turn, in every way. But when they finally could get them, they backed off. It doesn't make any sense. I think the better criticism is, why didn't Alex Hunter, go on and have a trial? But as is, I agree with Linda Arndt. She's going to say in a second that this is going to go unsolved. And I agree. No one's ever going to be convicted for this crime.
911. I get my radio number. And I said, the kidnapping has turned into a murder.
This house had suddenly become a homicide crime scene.
Oh, it became hell. JonBenet was brought up at about 5 minutes after 1. And at 10 after 1, nobody'd shown up. And I looked out the window to the street and I saw an ambulance slowly drive by. And I thought, I am in the Twilight Zone.
Meanwhile, the pastor led the Ramseys and their friends in prayer in the living room, holding hands as JonBenet's body lay before them.
I thought that would be the best way to organize everyone, to keep them distracted, to keep them from touching JonBenet, and to keep them focused on something other than looking at JonBenet.
1:20 p.m., after 3 hours as the only officer on what Arndt calls an incredibly tense crime scene, and 20 minutes after JonBenet's body was found, backup finally arrived. The next day, the autopsy on JonBenet was conducted. Linda Arndt was there.
I hadn't seen savagery done to a child or even an adult until the doctor peeled back her scalp and saw that horrific fracture to her head. It was the length of her head.
It was 8.5 inches long, and there was something else even more disturbing.
She had trauma to her vagina.
What kind of trauma?
It would be trauma that would be consistent with injuries.
Recent.
So, essay. Okay? Regular essay. So this is something you won't hear about in the documentary.
Recently?
I guess the best way to say that was what was seen was not a first-time injury.
The coroner, in fact, said the evidence was inconclusive, but ABC News has confirmed that 3 medical experts who consulted for the Boulder Police Department concluded the injuries were consistent with. As the Ramsey investigation dragged on,
3 experts consulting, they have nothing to gain or lose. Consulting for the police department, all conclude that this is habitual SA. So what is going on here? And this is why that they're so determined to bring back John Mark Carr as a suspect. They were like, well, this DNA, which is a topic for another day, but we'll talk about it a little bit in a second. But this DNA is just so important that we should bring it back, because there might be other signs that we overlooked with John Mark Carr. He might not have been a attention seeker with absolutely crazy attention seeker with no evidence to charge him with. We should have been looking further.
For weeks, then months, and then years, the criticism of Linda Arndt's actions that December day continued. But she still defends her actions, saying she has become a scapegoat for a flawed investigation. And Linda Arndt remains convinced that she knows who killed JonBenet Ramsey. She will not say the killer's name, but has no doubt that justice will never be done.
Do you think this person will ever be indicted, will ever be charged or convicted?
No.
What you're saying is, whoever killed JonBenet will get away with it.
Yes.
Right, they'll get away with it. And she's been proven right. That's for sure. But I just want to read quickly. So they put out an advertisement. Hold on one second. Here it is. The ransom note, just a little bit about the ransom note that left by JonBenet's killer contained quotes from several crime movies, according to her parents, which is odd for someone from a foreign faction to know all these American movies, who placed some of the phrases in a newspaper advertisement. John and Patricia Ramsey said they hope the ad, which is to run Sunday in the Daily Camera of Boulder, helps catch their child's killer. JonBenet's killer appears to be obsessed with techno crime movies and phrases from them, the Ramsey said in the ad. It is the 4th ad the couple have placed since JonBenet's death and includes phrases from the movie Ransom, Dirty Harry, and Speed. So she was found beaten and strangled in her family basement on the 26th of December, 1996, about 8 hours after her mother said she found a ransom note demanding $118,000. I mean, that's just like a punchline. There have been no arrests, although District Attorney Alex Hunter has called the Ramseys a focus of the investigation. Okay, that'll give you just a little idea there. But here's a little bit on the DNA. And a little bit more on the ransom note. So check this out.
The DNA results don't come close to proving that an intruder killed JonBenet.
It's certainly possible that an intruder was responsible for the murder, but I don't think that the DNA evidence proves it.
The only way I can describe this evidence is uninformative. It really is, it's not dispositive of the presence of a perpetrator. There is foreign DNA, but that foreign DNA can easily be accounted for by a number of innocent mechanisms.
So the interesting thing about JonBenet was she was found in underwear way too big for her, and it looked like new underwear had been put on her. People have theorized it was for her believe are her cousins who came over. Odd, but Henry Lee bought a whole bunch of new underwear straight from the package, and it had DNA in it. So DNA is everywhere.
Male DNA was originally identified in JonBenet's underwear during testing in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Lacey ordered new tests in 2007 and 2008 on JonBenet's long johns and nightgown. It's those tests that led Lacey to exonerate the Ramseys.
I can tell you in my experience,
a decision that confounded Troy Ide, a former U.S. attorney who was on the Ramsey task force appointed by Governor Owens.
There's a real danger whenever you say, okay, we've looked at this and we've categorically determined something.
The experts who reviewed the DNA test data for 9 News and the Daily Camera questioned Lacey's exoneration on.
Right, but they said at the end of this documentary they just have to test these things, and then they can just they get the answer. But DA Lacey has met with John Ramsey all the time, so they didn't want to talk to the Boulder PD, but he wanted to talk to the DA Lacey who publicly exonerated them. Isn't that interesting? He's not worried about being arrested talking to DA Lacey, but he is to the Boulder PD. So years later when he knows it's safe and he knows he's got a fan on his side, he'll talk all he wants, just the same way they talked all they wanted to the press. Very odd behavior that the documentary just never really deals with.
Multiple fronts. First, the DNA profile Lacey said belonged to the killer may not be the profile of a single person.
There is a reasonable chance that what has been attributed to a single individual actually represents DNA from multiple individuals that has been sort of hobbled together into a single profile.
Well, it's a rather obvious point, but I mean, if you're looking for somebody who doesn't exist because it's actually several people, it's a problem.
And as for the DNA on the long johns, heralded by Lacey as conclusive, our experts believe those 2 spots are mixtures of genetic material from more than 2 people.
It looks and appears to me to be at least 3 individuals. And so that there's a mixture here that's not just a single profile.
Which is precisely what Mary Lacey knew before she exonerated the Ramseys. This report, obtained by 9 News and the Daily Camera, went to Lacey's office 3 months before she cleared the family. Of the 2 spots on JonBenet's long johns, the report says it's likely more than 2 people contributed to the mixtures. And after eliminating JonBenet's DNA, the remaining DNA contribution should not be considered.
Thank you, Barb Nauman. Thank you, and Merry Christmas to everyone. Merry Christmas to you, Barb. Hope it's a good one. Is everybody ready? I'm having a little bit of my yearly Christmas panic. Anyone else? Anyone else? I'm not ready. I'm not ready. Too much to do. Too much to do.
Considered a single source profile.
She knew, based on your investigation, that this DNA wasn't necessarily from one person, and that it in fact was potentially accumulated DNA. She knew it at the time, and why she used this evidence to clear the Ramsey family then, a clearance that has continued because it's on the public record through today, is something I can't explain, and she should explain.
Mary Lacey never responded to our questions about her decision to exonerate the Ramseys. She left office in 2009, and she didn't respond to our calls, our emails, our letters, or our visits to her Boulder home. And if you think it looks like she set out to prove the intruder theory, you are not alone. Independent experts who reviewed the case told 9 Wants to Know and the Boulder Daily Camera they think Lacey succumbed to a phenomenon well known in human psychology. Understanding the DNA evidence in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey means understanding this. Everywhere we go, we leave little bits of ourselves.
Merely talking for 15 to 30 seconds is enough to detect a DNA profile on the desk in front of you.
That reality challenges one of the central tenets of the DNA evidence in the JonBenet Ramsey case. One made public when former Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacy exonerated the Ramsey family in 2008, saying that there's no innocent explanation for genetic material found in the girls' underwear and long johns.
My guess is that if we took your shirt and did some DNA testing on it at the level of sensitivity involved in this case, we'd find your DNA, we'd probably find some other people's DNA on there as well.
Lacy's exoneration letter said she had concluded that foreign DNA on JonBenet's clothing could not have gotten there inadvertently, something our experts say is just not true. They say there are plenty of reasons the DNA on JonBenet's clothing could be innocent, reasons that have nothing to do with murder.
You shed 40,000 cells per hour. You are leaving your DNA everywhere. When wherever you go physically, you're leaving a small part of yourself.
Mary Lacy discounted that possibility when she issued her letter exonerating the Ramseys and concluding the DNA must be the killers.
I thought that was a bit of a leap to claim that there couldn't be an innocent explanation for what was found.
How did Lacy's conclusion differ so much from the actual DNA tests? Lacy was long known to support the theory that an intruder, not a family member, killed JonBenet, something our experts believe could have led her to succumb to what's known as confirmation bias.
In human psychology, we like to see patterns.
I mean, this is the way that so much innocence fraud is done. It's like we like to think that any DNA found is going to be related to the crime. And that is not how DNA works. But we love it because we think it's specific and it erases any doubt. But very few, most crimes are done with just old-fashioned police work, not solved with DNA. I know a lot of cold cases are being solved with DNA, but that's not the norm.
We like to see puzzle pieces fitted together.
Confirmation bias can affect how an investigator with a theory interprets evidence.
You tend to believe data.
Just when he says puzzle pieces, does anybody from the Adelson case think of Rashbaugh? Puzzle pieces. What a terrible analogy that was in Charlie Adelson's opening, puzzle pieces. Horrible analogy. Because the puzzle pieces literally did not fit that case. It's like the puzzle pieces don't fit.
Which confirms your hypothesis. You tend to think of explanations to refute data which do not support your hypothesis.
Case in point, these never-before-seen emails. They show that after preliminary tests found the presence of unknown male DNA on JonBenet's long johns, an investigator in Lacy's office replied that his bosses didn't see the need for additional testing.
It sounds like they got a result that they were looking for and decided to quit while they were ahead.
The lab that Lacy used later provided her with reports showing that the unknown DNA on the long johns was likely part of a mixture of genetic material from more than 2 people, but that was never before made public until now. She issued her exoneration in spite of the confusing DNA results, an exoneration the family still points to as proof they were not involved. Just last month, Ramsey lawyer Lynn Wood used the exoneration to challenge news reports suggesting it could be a family member who killed JonBenet. In a tweet, Wood said, in 2008, Boulder DA publicly exonerated them and apologized. DNA evidence conclusive. End of story. And in another tweet, he said, this is a DNA case, plain and simple.
No, it is not. It's clearly not. We have a question profile that is very low level in terms of the amount of DNA. The quantity of DNA is very small. The profile is extremely complex. The one thing this case is not, it is not a DNA case, pure and simple.
A.M. JonBenet's mother, Patsy, goes downstairs and finds an apparent ransom note, 3 pages long.
I couldn't read the whole thing. I just gotten up. We were it was the day after Christmas, and we were going to go visiting. And it was quite early in the morning, and I'd gotten dressed and was on my way to the kitchen to make some coffee. And we have a bag.
She says in this documentary, she goes to make some coffee or whatever, and then John Ramsey says, I was shaving or whatever, or something. Like, they're so vague about what they were doing. You would think that would be burned in their brain, but I think the reason it isn't burned in their brain is it's a story that they're telling. You would know exactly where you were at the time. You realized your daughter was missing. I mean, it would just be, there's actually a scientific reason that we remember things connected with traumatic events. It's why people remember where they were when JFK or the shuttle exploded for those in the 80s, or 9/11. We remember where we were during traumatic events and exactly what we were doing. You know, I remember 9/11 like it was yesterday. I was in the office working a job. I was talking to my mother. I wouldn't say I was talking to my mother or something like that.
Staircase from the bedroom areas, and I always come down that staircase, and I'm usually the first one down. And the note was lying across the 3 pages across the run of one of the stair treads. And it was kind of dimly lit because it was very early in the morning. And I started to read it, and it was addressed to John. It said, Mr. Ramsey. And it said, we have your daughter. And it just wasn't registering. And I may have gotten through another sentence, like, I can't, we have your daughter, and I don't know if I got any further than that. And I immediately ran back upstairs and pushed open her door, and she was not in her bed. And I screamed for John.
The note asked for $118,000.
All right, we just went through this ridiculous note. Shelly F., thanks so much for the super sticker. Appreciate it. I mean, what a ridiculous note. What an SPTC. And Patsy had used the term hence in her Christmas cards. I mean, what foreign faction would use the term hence? So I'm just going to move through this a little bit. Here's Sina Wong, who has an interesting story. Maybe we'll revisit it in another episode, but she has an interesting story dealing with the Ramseys in litigation. They got her expunged from the litigation. Sure.
Professionally speaking, how certain are you that Patsy Ramsey wrote this ransom note?
It's highly probable that she wrote the ransom note.
Sina Wong has testified in more than 60 trials. She says she compared that ransom note with more than 100 samples of Patsy Ramsey's handwriting. She created these charts.
First of all, here are some similarities.
Claiming she found substantial similarities with the way certain letters were formed, such as these A's.
And so you will see that just with the A's, the ransom note writer has 4 different variations of the letter A. And then Patsy Ramsey uses the same variation of the 4 different types of A's.
In total, she says she found over 200 similarities in the writing, including unique ways letter combinations were formed.
On the first example, you'll see that when the letter T and E are written together, they connect, they touch. And on the second one, it's called a misplaced capital. There's a capital L in the middle of it. and the word will, and you'll see that there's a
So
capital
this
L
is
at the end of
Patsy's
it.
handwriting. This is the
ransom note, right? When the word unharmed is written, you'll see that the A, that this portion of it is up above. It's higher than the hump of the H, and that happens in both cases.
I mean, just a layperson looking at it, you can see that it's the first page of it is, or the first paragraph is very wavy, like someone's trying to disguise their handwriting. And as it goes on, it gets more fluid. Just like you cannot change the way you write consistently through 3 pages, which is another reason you keep it short if you're, where you cut out letters from a newspaper or whatever and put them together, paste them together, however you're going to do it. Because the way you write is so identifiable. So that connected L and T, did everybody see that? In the capital L's? Pretty interesting.
Ransom note. The ransom note was written on a pad and a pen from your home. And the question is, if the intruder was planning to write a note, why wouldn't he or she have brought their own pad and paper?
They knew that the less they brought in the house, the better.
But they planned to write a note?
Apparently.
Before or after the crime?
I think the note was written before the crime was committed.
This is another really interesting thing, is that John Ramsey always has an answer pointing outward. It's not like I didn't do it, but I don't know. I don't know why they did that. He seems to know why, what kind of person did this. Just he talks with such certainty in a way that Patsy doesn't. It's always pointing out, I was looking, I mean, I guess you could say that's a real action, but I mean, I'm not going to go over his mail again. It's such an odd thing to do when you're waiting for a ransom call. Look through your mail slowly.
What has thrown great suspicion in you, Mrs. Ramsey, as you know, is that some handwriting experts have said that there's a similarity between the writing on this note and your handwriting. This has been inconclusive, but the similarity of the handwriting is the strongest piece of evidence implicating you.
Well, if that's the strongest, then there's not much of a case.
There's not much of a case. It's not that I didn't do it. It's just that there's not much of a case against me. This is a common argument by guilty people. There's no evidence that I did it. Here's another look at all the similarities. Let's pause them for a sec so you can just really take a look. For those watching on or listening on podcast, I suggest you look at the video to really get the similarities in the handwriting between Patsy's handwriting and the handwriting in the note. About an hour and 5 minutes in.
Heard the theory yet. I totally agree that whoever wrote this ransom note killed our daughter. Yes, I concur wholeheartedly.
Okay. But now the note is not even really talked about as evidence in this documentary. It's just kind of like brushed aside to benefit John Ramsey anyway, and the Ramsey family in general. And it's a really good example of how in our society the wealthy have an advantage in every aspect. So that's what I have for today, guys. Please hit the thumbs up. Hit the thumbs up. It really helps. Share this episode. That's a really great way to help the podcast. Appreciate it. I'll see you tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern. We'll probably be returning to this subject sometime. There's more to say about this documentary and a lot more to discover. Have a great night, everybody.